every human life is exceptionally and uniquely made, and we believe in universal human equality, the first of which is life.
Charlie Kirk's story starts in the suburbs of Illinois, not in Washington or at political rallies. He was born on October 14, 1993 in Arlington Heights. Charlie is the youngest son of Robert and his wife. They were middle-class parents living the American dream. His father, an architect, taught him about structure and discipline. His mother supported his interest in politics and debates. Charlie did not come from a wealthy family or a long line of politicians, unlike many conservative figures he would later be compared to. He grew up in an ordinary environment which helped him understand the frustrations of everyday Americans. He would later bring these frustrations to a national audience. His education followed a path similar to many American youths. Charlie attended Wheeling High School, but what separated him from his peers was not academic excellence. In fact, Charlie never went on to complete college. Instead, he found purpose in activism. At just 18 years old, he co-founded Turning Point USA in 2012, a conservative non-profit organization with a mission to, quote, educate, train, and organize students to promote principles of freedom, free markets, and limited government, end of quote. But before Turning Point came faith. Raised in a Christian household, Charlie's worldview was shaped deeply by conservative evangelical teachings. Religion wasn't just something he practiced on Sundays. It became the backbone of his entire life and political outlook. Abortion, gender roles, marriage, all of these issues in Charlie Kirk's mind had clear answers rooted firmly in the Christian Bible. His critics would later accuse him of weaponizing faith for politics, but to his supporters, this was exactly what made him trustworthy. By the time most of his peers were still figuring out careers, Charlie was already appearing on Fox News panels and speaking at conservative gatherings. The young man who once walked the halls of Wheeling High School with little more than ambition was now being billed as the next big voice of the American right. And yet, even in these early years, the seeds of controversy were being planted. His decision not to attend college while building an organization that attacked leftist indoctrination on campuses was the first hint at the contradictions that would define him. Critics wondered how a man who never went through higher education positioned himself as the arbiter of what happens on campuses. But Charlie wasn't deterred. If anything, the criticism kept him going. Charlie Kirk's main achievement is Turning Point USA, which he founded in 2012. With just ambition and some funding from conservative donors, Turning Point USA quickly grew into a strong influence on American college campuses. Its goal is to fight what Charlie Kirk calls leftist indoctrination in schools and universities. With sleek branding, flashy events, and aggressive social media strategies, Turning Point USA spread like wildfire. By the mid-2010s, the group claimed chapters on hundreds of campuses across the United States of America, pushing pro-capitalist, anti-socialist, and hardline conservative messaging. Kirk, barely in his 20s, was now rubbing shoulders with some of the most powerful Republicans in the country. But his rise was not without controversy. Turning Point USA was accused of fabricating membership numbers, funneling money through dark channels, and using astro-toughing tactics, creating the illusion of grassroots students' activism when, in reality, it was heavily funded by billionaires like the Koch brothers. Even Politico, in a 2017 deep dive, suggested that Turning Point USA was less about student empowerment and more about grooming young conservatives to echo party lines. Charlie Kirk was building a brand, not a mere organization alone. He became a regular on Fox News, a darling at CPAC, that is, Conservative Political Action Conference, and a close ally of Donald Trump. His speaking style was sharp, relentless, and confrontational. Unlike older conservatives who packaged their ideology in diplomacy, Charlie Kirk went for the jugular. This approach won him massive support among the Republican base, especially as Donald Trump rose to power. Charlie Kirk became one of Donald Trump's most loyal defenders, frequently publicly showing his support and even serving as a bridge between the Trump campaign and young voters. On social media, he often went viral, not just because they echoed the right-wing narrative, but because they stirred anger, debate, and backlash. But as his influence grew, so did the controversies. Charlie Kirk's public statements often courted outrage. He criticized abortion rights in absolute terms, dismissed climate change as a hoax, and famously revealed his disdain for the idea of empathy. This caused his critics to argue that he wasn't merely debating policies, he was dehumanizing opponents. Perhaps most controversial were his racially charged remarks. On multiple occasions, Charlie Kirk made statements that many labeled racist and elitist. He once boldly stated that he wouldn't feel safe if his pilots were black, a comment that sparked widespread condemnation across America. This was during a 2024 podcast episode where he stated, quote, "If I see black pilots, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope you are qualified." End of quote. He has also been seen targeting black women in his speeches and podcasts. These comments cemented his reputation as a provocateur who thrived on division. However, this did not stop many young conservatives from viewing him as a role model. They saw Charlie Kirk as proof that you did not need a degree or a long political resume to make it in Washington. But for critics, he was a dangerous opportunist, peddling fear and division to climb the political ladder. Either way, Charlie Kirk had carved out a place for himself in American politics. He had slowly risen from a mere commentator to a bold and solid movement. And with power came exposure, setting the stage for the double standards and contradictions that would later unravel his public image, eventually leading to his tragic fall. Charlie Kirk's rise was meteoric, but so was the backlash. For every headline that praised his bold defense of conservative values, there was another headline calling him out for hypocrisy and double standards. One of the sharpest criticisms came from the Gen Z, the very group Turning Point USA was supposed to win over. Young people saw Kirk as out of touch, not only because of his hardline stances, but because of the contradictions in his worldview. He was a vocal advocate for gun rights, even as school shootings continued to rise. On his podcast at rallies, he dismissed calls for stricter gun control, insisting that it was, quote, worth it for lives to be lost to gun violence every year. To his opponents, this was reckless. To his base, it was fact. But when Charlie himself became a victim of gun violence, many pointed to the cruel irony. A man who championed unfettered access to firearms, ultimately falling by a bullet. Then there was his stance on race and religion. Charlie Kirk's critics accused him of spreading bigotry under the guise of patriotism. He pushed hard on Christian nationalism, calling America a country, quote, founded by and for Christians, dismissing pluralism as weakness. His framing often alienated Muslims, atheists, and even progressive Christians. Meanwhile, his racially charged remarks particularly towards Black Americans, were impossible to ignore. What made these controversies sting more was the double standard. Charlie Kirk regularly demanded accountability from the left while dodging it himself. He lambasted progressives for cancel culture, yet thrived on targeting individuals, mocking their personal choices, and stirring mob outrage against them. He denounced victimhood politics, but frequently framed conservatives as persecuted martyrs. For Gen Z, who had grown up navigating social justice movements, climate anxiety, and gun violence in schools, Charlie Kirk's message felt dismissive, elitist, and cruel. Instead of inspiring, he repelled. Instead of drawing young voters to conservatism, he became a symbol of what many saw as its ugliest face. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, the cracks were showing. Charlie Kirk was still influential, still commanding headlines, still close to Trump, but the backlash was louder, angrier, and spreading. His name wasn't tied to conservatism, it was tied to division, controversy, and contradiction. And those contradictions would become part of the narrative of his shocking demise. On September 10, 2025, Charlie Kirk passed away. His death came as a shock to his supporters and also rattled the entire political establishment in America. For a man who had built his brand on strength and dominance, the fact that his life ended at the barrel of a gun was a surprise to many. The circumstances were grim. Reports confirmed that Charlie Kirk was shot and gone, and though details remained under investigation, the suspect's identity quickly set off a firestorm. When authorities revealed that the alleged shooter was from Utah, Governor Spencer Cox's reaction raised eyebrows. He publicly expressed his disappointment not just over the killing itself, but pointedly because, quote, the suspect was one of our own. The remark drew instant scrutiny. To many, it sounded less like mourning and more like tribal embarrassment. Was the governor upset at the murder, or more upset that the murderer came from his state? Critics, especially on social media, interpreted it as a veiled statement tinged with racial undertones. Was it more of a lamentation that from our tree this rotten apple has fallen? It reinforced for some the very divisions Charlie Kirk himself had spent years feeling. On the other hand, conservative media outlets lionized Kirk, painting him as a victim of left-wing hatred. They framed his killing as a part of a broader war on free speech and conservative values. His name was invoked alongside slogans about protecting America from, quote, racial ideologies. But outside his circles, the narrative was far less flattering. Critics resurfaced his most inflammatory quotes, highlighting the deep contradictions between his rhetoric and his faiths. Some pointed out that while Charlie Kirk condemned identity politics, his entire career had been built on racial and cultural wage issues. Others noted how he called empathy weakness, yet now his death demanded national empathy. And then came the question of legacy. Was Charlie Kirk a bold defender of conservative values who paid the ultimate price, or a polarizing figure whose divisive rhetoric contributed to the very violence that ended his life? The answer depended on where you stood politically. But what we know for sure is that his death did not silence the debates. It rather magnified them. It turned his story from one of influence and controversy to one of tragedy and uncomfortable irony. In both life and death, Charlie Kirk challenged America to confront its own identity. His supporters regarded him as a warrior who was taken too soon, a man bold enough to speak the hard truths that others shied away from. The organization he founded, Turning Point USA, reaffirmed his message, pledging to uphold the principles of, quote, unapologetic conservatism. But for his critics, Charlie Kirk's legacy was far darker. He was remembered as a man who trivialized systemic racism, white male supremacy, and who turned politics into a spectacle of outrage. They pointed to his statements about black women, his dismissal of empathy, and his constant demonization of progressive movements as evidence that his rhetoric left America more divided than he found it. Because when they look closely at the manner of his death, it only sharpens the contradictions. A man who cheered at gun rights died by gunfire. A man who dismissed the dangers of extremism was killed by it. A man who mocked empathy left behind a grieving family, wife and children, and a fractured movement demanding empathy. At the end of the day, both perspectives ultimately converge on a single point, namely, Charlie Kirk was never irrelevant. Whether you love him or hate him, he knew how to attract attention. He represented the hyper-polarized politics of 21st century America, a political landscape where cliques take precedence over consensus, where sound bites are valued more than substance, and where figures like Charlie Kirk become symbols rather than individuals. But perhaps the clearest lesson of Charlie Kirk's story isn't even about him at all. It is about America. His rise revealed how anger and division can build empires, and his death revealed how those same forces can devour them. Even the governor of Utah's reaction, framed in disappointment that the killer was, quote, one of their own, understood how identity and tribalism continue to shape every corner of America's discourse. Charlie Kirk's life was a contradiction, his death an irony, his legacy a mirror that forces America to ask, is this the politics they've chosen, or the politics they have allowed to fester over the years? Many thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to this channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. I am your friend and host Ekeminudim, wishing you the best of time in all you do and thanking you for continually keeping us company on this channel.